A lot of us here are well aware that the US illicit drugs market has experienced a monumental shift in recent years from being solely dominated by plant-based substances like cocaine and heroin to being saturated with synthetic substances like fentanyl, phentalogs, and high-purity methamphetamine. Mexican TCOs, the main producers and distributors of synthetic drugs in the United States, rely on networks of chemical brokers, logistics firms, and, for the most part, Chinese and Indian chemical companies to procure precursors and other essential chemicals to manufacture synthetic drugs. Now, many of these essential chemicals are considered dual use, meaning they have a variety of illicit applications. They're used in agriculture, they're used in food processing, pharmaceutical industries, among others. And strict regulatory control of these chemicals often varies drastically from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So one of the main challenges for investigators is parsing out shipments of chemicals that are at high risk of being diverted for illicit drug production from those that are more likely used for legitimate purposes. Identifying companies that are importing chemicals known to be used in illicit synthetic drug production is a good start. But we propose going a step further by analyzing those shipments as a function of an entity's recent import history to identify the highest risk entities for diversion. Now, the brokers and the TCOs they service employ a variety of schemes to procure needed chemicals while evading law enforcement scrutiny. They'll set up front and shell companies that are used to legitimize imports of precursors and essential chemicals. They'll exploit global supply chains. They'll exploit gaps in regulatory regimes to move heavily controlled precursors through various third countries before onward delivery to clandestine labs. And of course, they'll conduct complex financial transactions in traditional fiat or cryptocurrency to, again, obfuscate their activities. So our next red flag typology is identifying entities with a high proportion in certain combinations of known essential chemical imports. So let's sort of unpack what we mean by that. Take acetic acid, for example, right? Acetic acid is the primary ingredient in vinegar and is used widely across industry. However, glacial acetic acid, a highly concentrated form of acetic acid, is also used in fentanyl and methamphetamine production. The little snapshot on the right here is an announcement from the government of Mexico highlighting the seizure of 88 tons of glacial acetic acid in the port of Manzanillo. Now, simply searching for acetic acid or even glacial acetic acid across our trade data like we did for piperidone isn't going to be very helpful. We're going to get a large number of entities, thousands, perhaps even tens of thousands, dealing in acetic acid, a vast majority of which for legitimate purposes. So how can we identify signals in the noise? In other words, how can we identify shipments of unregulated or minimally regulated essential chemicals like acetic acid that may be at high risk of diversion? One way is by focusing on certain combinations of chemicals imported by a given entity as a function of the entity's overall import history. Up until now, we've relied solely on Mexican import data, helpful for finding red flag importers like Entity 1, but not helpful to know who the real people are behind this company. To do that, we need to combine Mexican import data with Mexican corporate records. So what I've done here is added Entity 1 to our graph canvas tool, indicated by the red node in the middle. I've also expanded the relationships to identify the direct shareholders. And the shareholder information is derived from Mexican public records, in this case from Mexico's Public Registry of Commerce. On the right side here, we have a partial snapshot of Entity 1's articles of incorporation, sourced directly from Mexico's Public Registry of Commerce and available for download in Sayari graph. But not only are we getting general ownership and control information from these records, we're also getting rich identifying information from natural persons, right? We've got nationality info, personal identifiers like a CURP, which is kind of like a social security number in Mexico, and an RFC, which is a Mexican tax identifier. Really helpful identifiers for law enforcement building out target profiles, and obviously helpful for our financial institutions that are needing to sort of ensure that they're dealing with the right person or the right company. Now, nice thing about having all this information in a graph database is that it allows us to quickly build out the broader corporate and trade network associated with this target of interest. To wrap up this case study, right, we started with an entity identified as part of our analysis of certain precursor imports into Mexico. We combined Mexican trade data to validate Entity 1's imports of known essential chemicals that, apart from legitimate uses, can be used to produce methamphetamine and fentanyl. We use Mexican corporate records to identify the real people behind Entity 1, as well as other companies they own and control. At least one additional entity in the network has also imported large quantities of known methamphetamine essential chemicals from some of the same Chinese suppliers as Entity 1. And finally, we used Chinese corporate records to identify the likely beneficial owner of at least one of these suppliers. To kind of leave you all with a couple of key takeaways, we can kind of review the red flag typologies that we covered today. So red flag typology 1, shipments involving list 1 chemicals, right? So shipments involving list 1 chemicals, and in some cases their derivatives, may be indicative of potential illicit activity, especially if one or both parties involved in the transaction is a general trading company or freight forwarder, or otherwise not involved in the chemical or pharma industry. Red flag typology 2 concerns entities with a high proportion of imports consisting of known essential chemicals, right? And then red flag typology 3 are entities that mostly deal in non-chemical goods, but the chemicals they do import are known precursors and essential chemicals. So an example of this would be like the RAM entity we looked at previously. And then finally, once we've established these red flag typologies, we can then model these typologies at scale, and that can help us identify potential targets for investigation, or in the case of a financial institution, identify potential high-risk customers for further adjudication.